And I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for being here, particularly at this moment of global anticipation and anxiety. This special forum, as Martin said, is the first in a series of new initiatives at the Review of International Studies that we hope kind of explore innovations in the study of world politics. And I think it goes without saying that our hope is not really to set a new agenda, but to generate new questions, both theoretical and empirical, that continue to keep us attentive to the historical and contemporary structures and dynamics of world politics and how we should understand them. These forums are invited forums. They're led by a scholar whose work, in our view, is pushing the boundaries for the conceptual study of world politics, and will be in conversation with other scholars in order to create conversations that attend to how and why what counts as world politics should be recalibrated. So today's forum on the theme of disruption by design is curated by Nicole Grove, who is an associate professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Nicole's research explores the globalization of security and surveillance technologies, media infrastructures, and transnational networks of violence, and the relationship between space, security, and design. And for any of you who are familiar with your work, I think it goes without saying that her contributions to the study of world politics have really been on the cusp of dramatic geopolitical shifts. And it's been really eclectic for the attention it draws to practices such as crowdsourcing and habitat creation, amongst others, as reconfiguring the spaces and rationales of governance. Joining us today, or joining Nicole and us today, are Professor Louisa Moore, who is a professor of political geography in the Department of Geography at Durham University, Neel Ahuja, who's an associate professor in the Feminist Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Charmane Chua, assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Nicole, Louise, Charmane, and Neel for participating. It's a strange and stressful time, so their commitment to this dialogue is greatly appreciated. I think not just by me, but I'm certain for everyone who's attending today. Today's session follows a series of pre-recorded talks, which are available on the BISA website and will remain available after this talk. Following some introductory remarks by Nicole, we'll move into a question and answer period. I'm going to use my chair's discretion and kick off the conversation with a few questions, and then I'll open it up to everyone else. Before I turn over to Nicole, I also want to express my thanks to the British International Studies Association for making this event possible, and particular thanks go to Chrissy Duxon and also to Eddie Cohen, who's facilitating our dialogue today. So without further ado, I will turn over the screen now to Nicole.
Thanks, Nisha. So I'd like to first thank the British International Studies Association and also the Review of International Studies editorial team for inviting me to participate in this forum. And I also would really like to thank Nisha, who's just done so much to organize this and has been really extremely helpful in just kind of putting it all together. I'm also very deeply grateful to Louise and Charmane and Neel for the many ways that they've contributed to this forum. It's, again, it's very challenging times. And so I really appreciate that they have really been so generous in their ideas and around the topic. So I have a few short introductory remarks prepared just to frame some of the questions that I raised in the pre-recorded video, just perhaps for those of you who may not have had a chance to view them. And then for the event, I think will be primarily organized around discussion, and we'll get to unpack some of the questions and the themes in more detail in our conversations with each other. So the organizing question for the forum that I posed was, how have design and engineering become forms of intervention rather than a means of intervention, and also what happens when disruption rather than good governance becomes the metric of institutional success. And so one of the things I think that the different contributions to the forum have done is to try to interrogate this meaning of disruption. Why is it different from something like innovation or disturbance as a concept and as a term of description? And I think a partial answer to this is that the framing of disruption as a virtue, and here, I am drawing from terms like disruptive technology and disruptive innovation, but even going beyond that, thinking about disruption as a virtue means that we're really being constantly compelled to accept things like precarity and extreme experiences of dislocation as a positive thing, as a good thing. So I mentioned in the video a couple of terms, disruptive tech and disruptive innovation, that were attributed to two professors at the Harvard Business School, Clayton Christensen and Joseph Bauer, and they originally published an essay together in 1995 called Disruptive Technologies, and then later Christensen publishes The Innovator's Dilemma. And Charmane in her video, I think, elaborates more on how these terms are meant to describe certain kinds of changes in technological development that allowed for the creation of new competitors and shifts in markets that were displacing larger, more established firms and corporate alliances. And so I think the idea was that these larger companies would have to become disruptive or they would be disrupted. So obviously this term has shifted and it's mutated in so many different contexts, and we find what I called the gospel of disruption found in many, many descriptions of social and political problems and institutional solutions. So this begs the question of what kinds of authority and legitimacy are being authorized around this emphasis on disruption as a kind of virtue, as a good in and of itself. I also mentioned in my earlier contribution that militaries have, also sort of taken up this language. Militaries have also always been dependent upon various kinds of technological developments to sort of revolutionize or innovate military operations. And I can also, we could point to a number of essays, for example, that have come out of West Point recently that talk about how the US government and the DoD can harness disruptive innovation to win wars, and using terms which are coming from marketing communities like discovery-driven planning or lean startup methods, while making references to things like Shark Tank, right? And so also international organizations like the UN also have programs that are designed around the use of disruptive technologies. I mentioned the use of big data in agriculture and also gene editing as things that were being kind of put forward to achieve SDG goals. So I think that, today we find this idea or kind of gospel or notion of disruption, and this idea that we've entered into a new disruptive era, really kind of found in the language of all different types of institutional problems and solutions. And so for my intervention, I really wanted to think about, the forms of statecraft that we're seeing kind of emerging or being replaced around the introduction of kind of the notion of unprecedented innovation as an end unto itself. I think, again, the different contributions in this forum really look very, I think, creatively at the kinds of, what is being disrupted here, the kinds of differences that we can tease out between how protracted forms of violence may simply be trying to perpetuate themselves through the adoption of marketing languages, but also I think where we might be witnessing shifts in organizations of power around this concept of disruption and the use of this language in official discourse that also have to be attended to. But I also think even kind of in the former example, we have to think about, again, this idea of authority and also precarity that appeals to disruption as a virtue put upon us. I think and one of the questions that will probably come up in discussion is what is the difference between risk societies and, let's just say, disruptive societies, if that's a term that's useful. I also think we have to look at, again, the kinds of questions of state accountability or questions around state accountability when political interventions are framed. around what Louise called in her intervention, testing, and trialing. And this has to do with where we're seeing the breaking up of institutional norms and organizations around this kind of ethos of social and political experimentation. Another question I think that follows from this focus on disruption is what the difference is between disruption and something like the shock doctrine, right, which is the term that's credited to Naomi Klein, describes the ways in which national crises and national disasters were used as opportunities or are used as opportunities for implementing free market policies. So one of the things, or one of the ideas that I posed here is perhaps what's different is that there's a kind of, with the proliferation of an ethos that submits all of social and political life to beta testing, to experimental interventions. Maybe we could argue that around narratives about the shock doctrine or ideas about the shock doctrine, that these were more punctuated, right? That these kinds of interventions could perhaps only be implemented where certain kinds of opportunities arose, or we'd have, the presentation of crisis as an opportunity. But now I think we're really seeing everything, so many things, so many more things framed as an opportunity for disruptive innovation, where there is some question about whether sustainability or equality are really outcomes what the outcomes of these kinds of changes should be. And I think that's a question that we're having to ask. So I do hope that this helps to kind of set up the discussion a little bit. I do think we're, again, coming to this question of what disruption is and what it means to politics in different ways. So I'm excited about kind of bringing all of these ideas together for this forum. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nicole. So we'll move, I guess, directly to the question and answer portion. And as I said, I'm going to start off our conversation with a few questions that I'm going to pose to all of the panelists. And the first, I guess, is, despite my involvement in this forum, after watching the videos, one of the first questions that arose for me is what makes politics ripe for disruption today? As not just a means, but as Nicole puts it, as an end in itself, right? As a goal, as a value even. So do you see within your own work and in the connections with each other, a kind of genealogy of disruption that set the stage for what is observed today? And so maybe we can start with Nicole and we'll go to Louise, Charmane, and then Neel.
Sure. I'm unmuted. So I think, what makes politics ripe for disruption as an end, I think it's a combination of things, right? I think it's a combination of this project of neoliberal sabotage of public trust, and also the legitimacy of institutions of the welfare state. I think there is this kind of sense of impending doom or concern or anxiety around climate change, and a sense that, perhaps there's sort of little to be lost. And I don't think this is kind of widespread around the world, but, maybe we can kind of talk about these things together as a way of kind of framing how it is that disruption as a discourse can make the kinds of inroads that it's been able to do. And then, of course, there's this kind of Silicon Valley discourse around disruptive technologies, but I think we are kind of living in really challenging and catastrophic times in many ways. And so I think this kind of brings together all of these elements where disruption kind of resonates as a narrative, as a kind of way out of these issues. And I think that it's appealing because governments and people are looking for an exit strategy that isn't hard, right? That doesn't require sacrifice, or it doesn't require us needing to do more with less.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Nisha. So the question of disruption, and over the past week since we've begun to write and talk about this together, it's really kind of given me kind of a renewed interest in some of the kind of multiple genealogies, I think, that we're seeing in relation to disruption. So I found it really interesting that Nicole, in her initial introduction for us connects this to the Christensen and Bauer kind of management logics and rationale in terms of, and as they put it in their essay, thinking about new and different packages of attributes. And as I pointed out in my video intervention, this kind of notion of the attribute in the sorts of technologies that I'm interested in, machine learning, I think really do start to move us into something like an attributive mode of politics, in which what is sought through the modalities of machine learning are the kind of irregularities, surprises and volatilities of disruptive politics in terms of the effects on communities and societies, and the way that those things are folded back into the technology itself. And in the video, I say a bit more about that in relation to, for example, the pandemic, and how actually the notion of a successful machine learning model can persist even while there's a complete abject failure of government. And part of that, of course, is also around logics of prevention or protection, shifting towards notions of derivative forms of governing, which Charmane addresses in her video, thinking through also a time period that she dates from the 1970s, which I think is also something really interesting here in terms of the political economies of the crisis of Fordism, actually. And it's got me thinking about the relationship between, in terms of orders, the relationship between parts and wholes that we see in the kind of crisis of Fordist modes of production line forms of social industrial organization, and then the kind of onward impact into the politics of Thatcher and Reagan, and kind of notions of challenges to welfare state forms of storage, inventory, planning and prevention that start to moving to the 21st century now. I would suggest in the UK that we've got a crisis of those things again, but this is now much more about how to govern through forms of modeling and through forms of trialing. So I suppose I would like to say that the disruptive, the genealogy of disruption, we should perhaps also think about links to resilience debates, and Holling's work on the idea of disruption and ecological disturbances, and the capacity of an ecological system to bounce back, and the swift ways that actually business and management adopted those kinds of notions of resilience into their own thinking. And perhaps also Orit Halpern's work on cybernetics, and the kind of recent work that she's doing in a new book on resilience, where again she's thinking about what she calls a worldview composed of functionally similar entities. So I think she's also thinking about these notions of how disruption reorders and reassembles, so kind of back to some of the questions of form that Nicole originally poses in her introduction in her video. You can hear fireworks here.
Neel, would you like to go next, or should I?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Thanks so much to everyone for being here and being and part of this conversation. I'm really excited to hear from the audience soon as well. And I've learned from the work of many of you, so I really appreciate this opportunity. I guess the first thing I wanted to say about the question of the novelty of disruption, or what makes this a particularly disruptive time, is that Neel's presentation in particular helped me to think about the terms of the conversation that were set, where I think Nicole opens by asking if disruption has replaced good governance or replaced the conception of the polis. And I suppose that the first thought I have about its novelty is about whether we need to ask whether good governance was ever the goal of states, right? And I think Neel's intervention has really helped me to think about this question because of the way in which they suggest a kind of inventiveness in race engineering that has always been at the heart of settler colonial projects. And I think this was a shared argument we made across our interventions, that new forms of disruption are sort of intersecting with older protracted forms of violence. So I think to the extent that good governance has historically been delineated around the figure of the citizen subject, to the extent that this framing was conceived within the territorialized fiction of a polis, that has often, as far as colonial powers go, relied on the disruption of lives outside of its borders, it's sort of worth thinking about how, and thinking through the rhetoric of disruption and the ways in which it functions, it has long functioned sort of historically as a force of imperial power, even as we are seeing it sort of returning and becoming inscribed within spaces of the nation state, right? So obviously sort of Trump's America is what I'm thinking about here. But I do think that there is a kind of way in which disruption acts as a kind of claim on an anticipatory intervention, which I sort of tried to talk about in making this relationship, in drawing this relationship between finance and infrastructure in my little talk. But I wanted to maybe quickly sort of go into what I mean by that. So my work has been on logistics and the ways in which the circulatory imperatives of the global economy have shaped supply chain extractivism, dispossession, and exploitation at a planetary scale. So this is, of course, sort of a long story of mercantile capitalism from the beginning of colonialism and long before. But I'm sort of interested in how these accumulation strategies, how to make things move according to what political and economic logics, who sets the terms of that movement, and with the production of what kinds of subjects, have shifted patterns of this racialized violence over time. And what I've been trying to think through, and what these interventions helped me to think through, is the way that this particular age of disruption is a speculative fever dream, in a sense, and a desire to produce an image of productivity and capital accumulation where productivity has long been waning. And so for my sort of genealogy of accumulation strategies, I sort of start telling the story from the 50s to the 70s, where this is a story that's probably familiar to many of us. Amidst these crises of profitability and rising labor unrest, firms in the US began to offshore manufacturing in the industrialized countries that led to deindustrialization, rising employment, and the rise of the finance and real estate industries in the West, while they sort of relied on this creation, on the existence of surplus populations to reproduce a cheap working class of labor in the South. And so, I think that in this sense, thinking through the way that logistics has construed and connected supply chains at a planetary scale has been productive for me to think about the ways in which the spectacular growth of what we see all over, from eco Atlantic City in Lagos, Nigeria, to the ghost cities of China, to the massive use of concrete to produce new urban infrastructures, the massive growth and expansion of ports, are in ways indications of a futurity that are meant to stimulate growth, in which mega projects and mega infrastructural projects, particularly in the global South, have been sites, I think, of grand experimentations with promising the future of logistics-based, transportation-based growth, where I think in the past that relationship was one of extractivism. Today we see sort of people trying to increasingly tap into this logistics network, and the UN now has, the World Bank now has a kind of logistics development index, right, which is meant to sort of indicate that the more you are able to tap into these circulatory networks, the better your for modernization and developmentalism. So perhaps to sort of just try to close, I think the kind of spectacular and speculative growth of these hubs of global circulation are meant to indicate those features that are then meant to stimulate, jobs and influxes into the economy in ways that have been really uneven, right? So the Belt and Road Project promises precisely this, but many states that are sort of trying to tap into the future of becoming the next big port hub, for example, really the research shows that about 2% of all global logistics trade actually stays within your national economies, right? So what does it mean to produce these massive disruptive infrastructures when they sort of are reliant on these speculative promises? And finally, I'll just say, sort of thinking about the planetary scale of these supply chains helps us, I think about something Maria Mies has said, which is that supply chains in the modern instantiation are evidence that we are materially connected, but subjectively fragmented more than ever before. And so in some ways, this is a point that Martin Arbriella makes in his fantastic new book, Planetary Mind. The reproduction of a Chinese working class, on the one hand, hinges on the dispossession of Latin American peasants on the other, where the assembly of phones and Foxconn factories hinge on deforestation, contamination, cancer epidemics that occur in the mining of rare earth minerals that then go into your phones. So I think I'm interested in how forms of experimentation both indicate a speculative futurity that might never be delivered, and how at the same time the margins of the world system are increasingly becoming sort of sites of novel techniques for exploitation in this new age.
Wow, I've learned so much from all of your comments so far, and thanks again to Nisha and Nicole for inviting us. I think one of the things that we have to grapple with if we're thinking about disruption across different geographic and historical contexts, I mean, we just have to think about war and its disruptive force. We have to think about, whether, the kind of creative destruction of warfare was, always in some sense the modality rather than the end goal. And in the history of settler colonialism in North America, that's certainly the case, right? Because if you look at settler violence as something that was not necessarily centrally planned, but was part of, widely distributed land grabs that were happening on the frontiers of expansion, and then a kind of, secondary effect in which kind of more established political elites would try to then take control of the land grab that had already happened. It was the disruption itself that formed the settler colony, and the presumption of some kind of order was only retroactively established. Now, I don't think that we're going to come to some general theory of disruption. If we look at a different context of colonial warfare, the Iraq War, which I think is fundamental for understanding the current election and the current rising fascisms, part of the disorderliness that's unleashed is in the disorderliness of migration that occurs, where people are getting displaced in the multiplying forms of warfare that happen. And even those European countries that opposed the US war effort are finding themselves deeply affected by the disorder in the international system that emerges when a new kind of set of neo-colonial war tactics emerge. So I think that's a kind of big question. There's all sorts of political theories we can look at to grapple with the influence of war on politics. We can talk about the generalization of war into the state form. But I think that, more and more to me, it's becoming clear that we need to not do the conflation that Agamben does and not be able to separate out the liberal governmentality from the fascist governmentality, because then we can't understand the interrelation between the two and how they're both in some sense dependent on disordering. So that's one line of thought I'm having. And the other line of thought is that in order to theorize disruption, we have to constantly stick to the case. I don't know how to track it across all of these cases, but when we think of it as a scientific rationality, I want to just mention that in the case that I was looking at, where in US counterterrorism interrogation, there was a scientific theory behind why it would make sense to disrupt the prisoner's sense of time, space, scale, embodiment. And that came from behavioralist psychology. It went back to the experiments of Pavlov's dogs and what it meant, what the difference was between repeating something such that the object of the repeated event could gain knowledge of it, and rupturing that knowledge, changing form, improvising, doing something different so that knowledge can't be created. And actually, through that improvised action, generating an archive of responses. So there's something about the form that disruption exercises in that context. It doesn't have to be the newest thing. It doesn't have to be the neoliberal, when you go back to Pavlov, there's a kind of different set of rationalities behind behavioralism. But, that improvisational technique was useful in its own time, and then could be applied in a different setting in order to generate an archive of intelligence in a setting that's totally different. So these are 2 points that I have that are not bringing us towards a synthesis, but that are posing the question of differences. And I think that what's exciting about this conversation is actually looking at all the different contexts that everyone's work is pointing us to, that it's taking us into different threads.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. And one of the themes I kind of drew from kind of each of your interventions here was this allusion to experimentation. And I think also that notion of experimentation comes out in all of the talks you posed. And this notion of experimentation, I think, hinges on the term that Neel, you use in your talk called inventiveness, which I really understood as kind of the ability to kind of engineer new subjects of power in really innovative ways. And so when I thought of it that way, one of the things that came to mind here is that if we kind of draw on Foucault's notion of the diagram of power, inventiveness or experimentation seems to shift us from the blueprint to the prototype of some kind. And so I was wondering kind of how we would build on the prototype as a kind of new modality of power, or if we thought of the prototype as the architectural diagram, what would its effects be, and kind of what would it do to, how does it show how disruption is distinctive and then also dangerous?
So I could start. I think that I do think this idea of the prototype and the beta test are similar. And maybe I'll just sort of talk through this question with a specific example that Louise brought up in her video, which was Cambridge Analytica. And so, what Cambridge Analytica did was it appropriated millions of Facebook records and then created profiles of voters. It did a lot of different things. So this is one of the things that it did, is it created profiles of voters in swing states across the US, and then sold this information to the Trump campaign in 2015, 16, which then helped to, for example, craft advertisements that targeted Black voters in swing states by placing them into a database marked for what was called deterrence, right? And this was to try to invent tactics that would make these voters not go to the polls or not vote for Clinton by showing like the super predator video and Facebook ads, for example. And so I think, what Cambridge Analytica did was very different from what pollsters do, right? Cambridge Analytica wasn't following accepted guidelines for polling models. It was really trying to measure opinion through experimental, and it wasn't trying to measure opinion, I'm sorry, that's what polls do, right? They use established methods to try to, use or create measurable criteria without necessarily, or at least in theory, influencing those opinions. But what Cambridge Analytica does is it actually uses experimental methods of voter suppression, right? And again, success is not determined by this set of standardized criteria for polling. They're experimenting directly on the environment, and the success or failure is really determined in the field. So, this is like the equivalent of trying to create opinions and behaviors by just sort of tapping at people's anxieties the way that you would, like a child would tap at like a fish in a fish tank. So the point is not to necessarily refine these forms of micro-targeting to get better information. It's really to use, the data that they have in whatever capacity that they can to shift to new kinds of experiments that could be placed into a database that's marked either for things like agitation or deterrence or what have you. And then also the outcomes are really unclear. So it's like the experiment is the intervention and the intervention is the experiment. So I think with regard to this question of power and like what disruption does in terms of, challenging power, as a determining rationality, I think this is a question that, at least for me, the notion of disruption raises, maybe it could be argued that there's a little bit of anthropocentrism in the way that Foucault conceives the power, right? So when we think about something like a disruptive algorithm, you know, we might need to add back certain kinds of characteristics to those analyses that would go beyond something like power. We might have to start thinking about things like affect, right? Or visual sensory experiences or bodily dislocations. And then I also think we have to consider the ways in which these kinds of techniques and tactics are implemented within mediated environments. I think that's a big part of this story too. So like, I think the categories of power is important. I'm not sure, and I'm still thinking about whether or not it's entirely sufficient. So maybe in some ways I'm kind of posing a question to the question of power, about whether or not, you know, we're entering into new kinds of zones of influence, where paradigms like control or paradigms like power, you know, do they survive in, you know, in these kinds of zones, or are they shifting or mutating in some way? I'll stop there. I have more to say, but I'm
No,
hear what others have to say.
yeah, I don't know, Louise, Charmane, or Neel. I feel like I'm in my Zoom seminar. I'm gonna like pick on someone, but I don't know who wants to, if anyone else wants to intervene on this.
I could say something just to follow up in terms of thinking about experimentation and sort of, you know, what sort of mode of experimentation are we thinking about here, and why might that matter? So and I was thinking about the, you know, Nicole's original framing of this in terms of the beta test, the alpha and the beta test, and in particular how engineers think about what the role of the beta test is. And I guess I was thinking about the field work that I've done over the last few years with computer scientists designing deep learning algorithms, and the centrality of the trialing. And that was something that, you know, I'm finding really interesting because of the relationship to our conventional notions of experimentation in relation to hypothesis, you know, that you formulate a hypothesis and test it. And what's happening here instead is a kind of, you know, abductive logic almost, as Luciana Parisi would describe it, where, you know, working back, if you like, from the framing of the problem. And you know, this really matters in spheres like the use of deep learning algorithms in election campaigns, as Nicole's talked about, but also areas like the use of this kind of machine learning engineering for border controls and immigration, in which this is not at all a matter of testing a hypothesis, but instead setting a target, right? So, you know, in the current context of the Home Office in the UK, setting a target in terms of an immigration target and working back from that target so that the problematization is framed from the output of the algorithm. So now for me, this is, you know, significant because of the way that we've conventionally thought about the relationship between science and government, I suppose, in the context of international relations, the link between science and politics, because, you know, and I know this is probably something you want to come to later, but it does raise then questions of what does this do to our capacity for resistance? Where are the spaces of critique? You know, if we have to kind of invert this Deleuzian relationship between problem and solution, where it's not the problem gets the solution it deserves, but instead the solution is framing the problem, so that what the border is, what it means to cross the border, what it means to govern a pandemic, that these very ideas that we might say should be the subject of politics and political contestation are worked through the shifting of weights, parameters, and thresholds in a model. So, you know, so I described in the video how the kind of political significance for me, and maybe this is not the same thing as thinking about the state, but is this really this double political foreclosure, where you have the first foreclosure that makes it much more difficult to make a political claim that's not already somehow recognized and registered as part of society, and then that the disruptive effects of that foreclosure is folded back into the framing of a model of society that will be used to govern through volatilities, and to govern even folding its errors back into the capacity to refine the model. So that closes out even the space for us to prize open failures or to prize open rates of error and to say, look here, this thing did not work, right? It completely closes down that space. So I suppose for me, that's the kind of most significant political question, to think this relationship through between science and government, and how we kind of work with this different way of thinking about experiment and modulated modification that's happening continually through trials in public spaces. Yeah.
I'll try to be quick because I'm not sure. I want to share an example because I think it's a helpful one. And this is not from my research, it's from one of my PhD students, Amy Mal, who has spent many years in India working on development and finance. And one of the things she's looking at is the thing called India Stack, which I'm not sure if folks have heard about, but it's a sort of massive digital system deployed at the national scale, which is meant to institute a common national identity, a common national platform for payments. And what it's essentially trying to do is lend people digitally through vouchers. But I think the scale of this is making me rethink what the prototype really looks like, because this is meant to be mobilized at a sort of national scale. And it's doing everything from turning money into digitized payments to moving things that used to be part of collective land titles. So fertilizer, land tilling, all of it are being moved into vouchers that then sort of breaks up collective land title. And, you know, bank accounts sort of become transmuted away from money and into this sort of cashless system that then the people who are investing in it have guaranteed assurance on returns, because what they have basically done by getting the Indian government to sign on to this platform is that if you know, Indian workers have taken on a certain amount of debt, the company that has sponsored the cashless payment system gets repaid through the Indian government's welfare payments. And so workers have to work double time to make up their debt for the welfare payment that goes back to the stack system, and then on top of that to earn money just to live. And so there's a form of, I think, something that looks similar to micro lending that we saw sort of with Grameen Bank in the 90s to 2000s, but reiterated through this form of algorithmic experimentation that that just, I think, is an interesting example to think through it about the prototype, because of the scale at which it is also premised on disrupting sort of entire forms and ways of life that are based on, you know, I think transmutations of older forms of bonded labor, but now at a scale that is national. And now this stack form is being transported to other contexts, right? I think Nigeria is thinking about it too. So I just wanted to offer that as an example that we might think with.
Yeah, the comments that people have been making about the retrospective kind of rationality of disruption. I loved, Luis, what you're saying about the solution defining the problem. And I'm also thinking about help me if I'm misunderstanding this, but I think, Charmane, part of what you argued in the video was that the concretization of large-scale infrastructure projects are in some sense retrospectively vesting a financialized relation with some kind of material, you know, thing that can then anchor its future value. And so in the temporality of the prototype, it takes an interesting form here when it's being kind of tracked back through that, either of these types of sets of relations. So I'm very fascinated by that in both of your works. And Charmane, one of the interesting things this brings up for me is, you know, when thinking about infrastructure and Chinese development, particularly following the 2008 financial crisis, one of the things that you would hear is that, in a sense, and this is maybe in an esoteric set of conversations within the US left, but one of the things that you would hear is that, in a sense, like, Chinese infrastructure projects saved US capitalism because there's this lending relationship that the Chinese government does, and that those dollars then get poured in to the infrastructure projects in a way that prevents there from being a broader shock. And I'd be interested to hear like whether that type of thinking figures into how you're looking at these mass infrastructure projects, specifically within the Chinese context or in any of the other contexts that you look at, because it seems like that need to kind of create a prototype, even if it's a failed one, is something that is being produced through the financial relation. And it's also part of the governing rationality that Louise was talking about. So I'm trying to think about those two levels and how they might interrelate.
All right. That's great. I'd like to now open it up to the to everyone and create a kind of larger dialogue and conversation about this. So if you have questions, I invite you to either put them in the chat or to raise your hand, and with my kind of Luddite way, I will try to make sure that I can capture and see your question, and I apologize if I miss anyone. But maybe just to kick things off, I'm gonna build on this comment that was posed by Sustainable Systems Research Foundation. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sorry, I didn't change my name. Hold on. How's that?
Oh, okay. From Ronnie Lipschutz, because I think the question that you raised, Ronnie, is interesting, and you can build off of like how I interpret it, because you have this discussion of kind of disruption as innovation at the same moment that we've seen a kind of massive proliferation of warfare, right? And the new ways in which war has become legal and also legible, right? And what Derek Gregory would call the everywhere war. So how do we balance this sense of a kind of new modes of governance actually through disruption with the actual kind of material destruction of life in many contexts, right?
Right.
How do those connect? And I don't know if that's the question you're asking, but
not exactly. I mean, I was trying to sort of put together this, disruption by innovation with the question of war. But wars often produce significant social changes and what we could call innovations. They lead to redistribution of power, in societies. And if you think about, accumulation not only of monetary, but also of social capital, as a consequence of disruption, or as the intent of war as disruption, as power, maybe that's the way to think about it. I think about, Jonathan Nitzan's argument about capital as power. And more, although I initially years ago couldn't quite figure it out, I think more and more he is spot on. Especially if we think of other forms of capital, a la Bourdieu. So this raises, of course, a question of what happened in pre-capitalist societies, and how did you explain war then? And I'm not going to try and do that. And I'm not even going to try and explain the world wars. But a lot of the violence, and again, there's a kind of a rationality in this that makes me very uncomfortable. But remember that once an internal war starts, you basically have to make choices, rational choices, in order to survive. And regardless of what the sort of cumulative goals of those who have triggered the wars are, choosing the wrong side may mean that you don't survive. I'm doing a radio show on Sunday about a second civil war in the United States, so I'm thinking a lot about this.
Maybe
Anyway,
I can see if any of the panelists want to, or if there are any questions on this theme that relate to this theme, we can, don't see any hands or nothing in the chat. So maybe I'll let the panelists respond. Oh, Debbie Lisle.
This sort of takes it in a little bit of a different direction. I hope that's okay. Maybe somebody with a big brain can make some connections. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Like, that was so great, especially in these last couple of days of terror. I wanted to ask a question about, I think it might be to everybody, possibly Louise, but and Nicole, but I wanted to ask this about obviously about failure, but failure in relation to learning. And it was sparked by Louise's comments about the kind of COVID disasters, because in a way, in my work on failure, what I'm discovering is failure is totally disappeared, right? It doesn't matter how obvious the failure is they're so obvious at the moment, and it doesn't matter how outraged we get at the failure, and it doesn't matter who's excluded or abandoned or whatever, because it always leads to learning. Right? So learning is the thing that excuses everything. And that's why it leads us to this whole thing about the trial and the test or the demo or the experiment or the prototype. All of it and all of the wreckage and the aftermath is excused because it feeds learning, and whether that's machine learning or different types of learning. So I wanted to ask, I think we do need to do a little bit more thinking about learning itself. And it's one of those questions that feeds into my favorite kind of Wendy Brown, like, who can be against learning, right? Learning is the ultimate good. And it made me think about two things. One is Louise, I think, sets out this terrific project ahead of us, which is there's so much work to do recovering the traces of, or the kind of residual traces of the failed experiments. Right. So the way that I've been thinking about this is like, what's discarded on the laboratory floor? Like what life worlds exist there? And then the second thing I wanted to ask about, this might like link across some of the papers, which is again prompted by Louise's question of how we might resist or hold accountable some of these ideas, or how we might interrupt. That's the way Louise put it, which is to think about uselessness. And if anybody had anything to say about, like, because a lot of this is about the instrumentalization of learning or failure or testing or trialing. So might uselessness be, or to do something useless, might that be a productive interruption? Thank you very much to everybody.
All right, I'm gonna take, oops, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm gonna take one more question from Jesse and then turn it back to the panelists.
Hi, everyone. Appreciate all of your interventions so far. Just to, I guess I hear a lot of weddedness to Foucault and a Foucauldian paradigm that I don't know, despite having started there myself, I'm wedded to anymore. And I guess what I found myself thinking about with disruption is in terms of Certeau's thinking, right? He talks about the difference between strategies and tactics, that those who have a lot of power try to lock down space over time as a strategy. And what we call disruption is really competition between those systems, right? The competition between different strategies of locking down space and time, and how everyday people, particularly people without a lot of power, in Certeau's term, have to sort of tactically navigate the disruptions of these other competitions. Of course, the thing Certeau doesn't talk about enough is gender and how this is all about competitive patriarchies. But the question I guess I really want to throw out is, to what extent can disruption be planned? Because I hear you all about the logics of prototypes in particularly Facebook as the greatest participatory action research experiment in the history of the world, right? What do we do to ourselves when we all do this? And at the same time, I don't think that logic transfers to military campaigns, where we see over and over again the idea that we can go in and not disrupt things. And we accidentally create all kinds of disruptions, and particularly competitive counter-patriarchy forces, right? We produce radicalization, for example. We produce nationalism, for example, through our military interventions. So what I guess what I'm really sticking on is, how much can this stuff be planned? I mean, sure, there are actors who can profit from disruption, but how much can disruption really be planned? Thank you.
Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure. Maybe I'll just touch on the question of failure, and then also this idea or this question about whether or not disruption can be planned. I think, Debbie, I totally agree with you. I think, what disruption does as a kind of official discourse is that it does become a way to, marshal failure on the parts of states as somehow being an asset in some ways, right? And I think that's kind of the point, right? It's about how to remove, it's one of the points, is how to remove failure from the lexicon of state authority as if failure isn't a possibility, right? So this is, I think, why you're kind of seeing the absence of this word in the places where you're looking, as if, it's only about learning more. Well, this happened, and so this is an opportunity for us to just learn more, as if all of these kinds of experiments in social and political life are really just about a learning process or a test. And so, a question that Nisha had posed to us earlier prior to this event was, what do we lose, or do we lose the ability to fail? And I think the we is really important here, because I think states do tend to remove the possibility of failure for themselves. But we will be held accountable for precisely, how we fail to adapt, or how we succeed in adapting to these kinds of experiments. So, what are the kind of normative and what are the political consequences of this? I think that we have to figure out ways of holding the state and international institutions and corporations accountable again, right? This is not a particularly new insight, but it's a sustained one, right? Because without the ability to hold officials or tech companies or corporations or what have you accountable to particular kinds of standards that we determine for what success and failure are on our own terms, and it does become difficult to hold them accountable. And I do think the proliferation of this discourse of disruption, allows failure to almost kind of become increasingly unintelligible or illegible, right, to the outcomes for states and for other actors. Can disruption be controlled? This is a good question. And I think, I think the answer is no. I think maybe it does blend a little bit with, some ideas that, I've been thinking about and have been generated by our exchanges, our collective exchanges, which is, the ways in which disruption and sort of innovation, this question of whether or not they're synonyms. And I think, innovation, may have been about, in some ways, confronting a kind of obsolescence, right? But disruption, again, has become this virtue in its ability to unsettle our lives, right? It suggests that we should thrive on dislocation, and that we should be prepared and even welcome our lives to be entirely torn asunder because of some new change that affects, so many things all at once. And I think that's a kind of a difference. And this also kind of, I think, feeds into a conversation about what the difference between risk societies are. Where risk societies, where in risk societies, precariousness is naturalized. But I think, precarity is seen as something that is sort of uncontrollable in risk societies, right? It's something that exists. And it can be kind of harnessed or leveraged, but it's something that we kind of have to contend with. And even when Beck and Giddens are writing about risk societies in the 1990s, they're talking about them in the context of critique. They're talking about them, and it's a kind of form of lamenting about, learning to cope with risk. But disruption is really about championing precarity, and it's about championing dislocation. it enters into official public discourse and private discourse as a positive thing. So I think in some ways that's also a difference. And so we've kind of reached this period, and maybe this is how I'll blend those two questions together, is that we've reached this period where governments and institutions can kind of celebrate or maybe even brag about how disruptive their initiatives are, their projects are, and that we might even lament a lack of disruption, right? That without enough disruptive tech or enough disruptive policies, that things would be too sustained or too consistent. And that's not to say that all governments or institutions should be sustained. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Did Charmane, Louise, or Neel, did you want to intervene on this before we head to some more questions?
This might be an orthogonal response. I was thinking, Debbie, if I hear you right, I hear you not saying learning as a sort of affirmative, positive thing, but how do states claim the language of learning in order to sort of paper over failure? And I think the terms on which I've been thinking through this relationship between failure and learning has been in the language of counterinsurgency, particularly in the recent period of what feels like sort of sitting in the middle of the decline of American empire, the sort of continuous failure of the state, which it does not necessarily see as a failure, right? The kinds of ways that Neel was pointing to, disruption as a claim that comes from outside. So climate change is disruptive or terrorism is disruptive, but the claim to that disruption then allows you to produce a disruption from the state. And I've been thinking about the ways in which, even as the state attempts to disrupt certain forms of collective life, so too have those disruption produced forms of racialized violence that are not received without resistance, right? We are seeing in this time that the sort of the most historic popular uprising in the US. And so I think that some of the terms I've been trying to think through kind of, inspired by Maunu Karuka's notion of counter-sovereignty is in what ways are failures also reactive moments of counter-revolution, right? That reinventive forms of governance and that are sort of premised on disruption are, I think we're seeing in some ways, meant to be learning opportunities, counterinsurgent opportunities to then shift progressive demands into a discourse of the state's reforms. And I feel like I'm going a little bit off topic here, but particularly with the George Floyd uprising, what we saw was the kind of rise of abolitionist calls for the abolition of the police that have then now sort of become inscribed into counterinsurgent reforms around using the language of abolition, learning from the language of abolition, right? To essentially hide what are some quite, I think, invasive forms of surveillance and policing. So the removal of cash bail, for example, has been touted as a form of abolition, and what it is replaced by is other forms of predictive policing that are based on calculative techniques of racist surveillance, right? So I suppose in that sense, I'm interested in thinking about the ways that this failure learning dialectic is also a reactive dialectic to what continues to be insurgent forces, and the ways in which that might actually help us or demand that we also shift the terms of disruption and struggle over its meaning so that it's not just about disruptive innovation from above, but what might it mean to insist on the relevance and constancy of disruption from below, right? What does it mean to think about the highway blockades and the blockade at Standing Rock and demands for a world otherwise as disruptions that attempt to disrupt the dominant form?
Before I get Louise and Neel to chime in here, I'm going to turn to Thomas and throw another question out there for everyone.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this event. My name is Thomas George. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Brussels Schools of International Studies. I would like to go back to maybe the big picture of what you want to achieve with this conceptual or analytical approach here. I think that considering how design and engineering can become forms of political intervention is really interesting, because it disrupts the idea we have of disruption, the idea that disruption is something that is coming from the outside, something that is external to us. And I get a sense that the concept you are manipulating here opens an avenue to think how disruption can be perhaps socially constructed as well. Now, the topic can also get very technical when we speak in terms of prototypes, tests, experiments, and so on and so forth. And I believe there is a tension that appears when we borrow such terms. And the tension is to maybe depoliticize disruption. And I think this tension can be illustrated by the question of large-scale violence. If I go back to the question you raise in the abstract of this event, what happens when disruption rather than good governance has become the metric of institutional success? Well, let's consider maybe this question that I'm paraphrasing here, but what happens when disruption replaces or even neutralizes politics? Because in the case of military technologies, or in the case of space colonization, for example, political and ethical orientations and challenges posed by new disruptive technologies seem to completely disappear in discourse behind the very technicality, behind the very techniques at stake in such technologies. And similarly, critical security studies have also investigated the paradox of how technology depoliticizes conflict while at the same time co-constructing forms of politics as well. So my question is, from this perspective, how does the analytical approach of disruption by design help account for the invisibility or the visibility of politics in what we could call the spectacle of technology? And if design and engineering are a form of political intervention, then how to account for movements of resistance to it, perhaps in a Foucauldian tradition? So that would be my 2 cents to the concept, but also my question. Thanks again. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Louise or Neel, or Louise, go ahead, and then Neel.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Thomas. That's really interesting, and actually connects back, I think, to what Debbie was asking also in terms of her question about interruption, because I think I do share some of your concerns around, how might we conceptualize or think through this problem of disruption in relation to some kind of counter mode of disruptive force, and actually what would that look like in relation to the kind of politics of technologies. And so I suggested in the video that I was drawn to the idea of interruption, and we're all just thinking through these things, so this isn't fully developed at all, but I was struck by the kind of distinction between disruption and interruption, because of the way that disruption signals are breaking apart, where interruption is a breaking between or in between. So there was something about interruption which actually kind of, for me, brought to life some of the forms of resistance that I think I am seeing happening in some of the spaces in which some of these kinds of military technologies, but very often it's exactly the same kind of deep learning neural networks that are being used in the drone program, that are also being used in city streets for facial recognition, for gait recognition, and so on. So in many ways, the distinction between war and, I'm sorry, more Foucault, politics by war by other means and politics continues there. So interruption as a way of thinking about a kind of interruption of the scene itself, so it's a kind of, from Brecht's notions in the theatre, it's about a sort of freezing of the scene, or a momentary gap in the frame where it's possible for us to ask, how are these things arranged the way that they are? And I think that's where maybe I would disagree with what you're saying a little bit in terms of the technology depoliticizing, because my starting point here would really be that that these are thoroughly ethico-political already, these entities that we're thinking about. And actually the politics of these technologies is really, for me, is an important starting point. So you also asked about the disruption and good governance, but I guess that what's also going on here in a sense is that part of the reason why I would describe these kinds of techniques as kind of political technologies is also because of the ways that they're framing what we even mean by good governance, right? So what does it mean to have a good society? How do we think about ideas of how society ought to be or how society ought to live? So I think these are deeply, ethical and political questions. And I think that increasingly they're inflected through the sorts of technologies, disruptive technologies that we're talking about. Thanks.
There are so many great threads to this conversation, and I want to comment briefly on two of them. The discussion that was happening earlier with Debbie, Nicole, and Charmane about knowledge and about how the experimental form of state interventions as being failure masquerading as knowledge, I think is a really fascinating point. And I loved, Charmane, your end point on how it's actually a way of avoiding resistance. And I think that part of what goes on with that is that there's also a kind of almost like a scale question involved in how the state views resistance. And this is also connecting to Luis's work, right? Because what happens when you literally try to map every single voter, or when you're trying to get such a micro detail in terms of generating certain types of knowledges. And this reminds me that Arjuna Padarai wrote a book right after the Iraq War was launched called Fear of Small Numbers. And he described that war as a vivisectionist form of warfare, precisely because there's a specific type of fear attached to a kind of minority resistance. So I wonder if there's an interplay between knowledge, failure, but also like counter-revolution happening in this cluster of ideas. The final note I want to end on for my comment is just to acknowledge, Jesse, your comment in the chat and how vital it is that we think about precarity at the university and the institutional connection of the university to disruption, which can be analyzed in all kinds of different ways, whether it's through the actual production of the knowledge forms and technologies that are doing this disruption work, or whether it's in the real estate claims that universities make on their local communities, the way that they treat workers, the way that they privatize education. So many threads there where the university is actually embedded in this.
Before I turn it back to the panelists to comment on Thomas's question, because I imagine Nicole has something to say, I just wanted to see if there are any other questions. We do have a little bit more time before we wrap up. And I can't see everyone at the same time. All right, well, maybe Nicole, I imagine you have something to say about Thomas's question, so maybe I can turn it over to you, and then we probably have time for one more question. So do let me know if there's something you'd like to ask.
Okay, thanks, Nisha. Thanks, Thomas. I do, I also appreciate this question. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about, this idea of disruption as being an analytical approach. I don't see it as an analytical approach. I see it more as kind of a set of questions, at least at this point right now. So, but I do think your question about technology, I agree with Louise as well, that I think in our different ways, we are trying to kind of politicize a lot of these events and politicize these phenomena. And in terms of disruption as kind of being something that is sort of external or kind of happening to something, Neel's work on kind of this sort of construction of the climate refugee and also counterterrorism and torture, I think kind of demonstrates how, kids at home, demonstrates how I think we are kind of seeing disruption as something that can be kind of designed into systems and designed into people's kind of experiences of self and of time and of the body. I'm thinking of one example here. There's something called, just because you mentioned, the field of design and kind of the importance of parsing out these terms and what they mean. I totally agree with you. And I think that there's a lot more work for at least me to do around that. But there's something within the field of design called designing for disassembly. And this is where, a number of design and architectural firms have been calling for buildings and homes that are designed kind of from the beginning, right, from their inception, to be taken, down, like through what they would call a kind of circular economy of using and reusing building materials. And this is all really done under the guise of sustainability. But I think what underwrites this particular kind of design ethic is the idea that these structures, whether or not they're kind of public housing or convention centers or whatever they are, that they're never actually meant to be permanent, right? So we can see disruption sort of being designed into, or even we might question whether or not disruption is being designed in enough where the purpose is to kind of build up and intensify disruption within these types of structures, or, again, kind of referring to Charmane's work within these kinds of circulations of logistics. And maybe we can extrapolate these ideas to forms of governance as well.
We're coming to our kind of final few minutes, but maybe just seeing as there are no questions in the chat or no one's raising their hand, maybe I can return to a point that Louise raised and also Charmane referred to, but it's the kind of resistance. We can see, I think, a lot of the emerging logics, maybe not necessarily of control, but kind of different logics of social organization, for lack of a better word. But how do we draw on kind of the interruption? Like what would resistance look like if we drew on interruption, or if I were to interpret, Charmane, your approach as kind of like insurrection? So what are the kinds of resistance that that you are figured to see in your work or prompted to imagine based on the cases that you're exploring? And maybe I'll go in reverse order this time, and I'll start with Neel, Charmane, Louise, and Nicole, and we'll kind of conclude there.
It's a vital question, and I think that it plays out in different ways in the different kind of contexts of sort of disruptive modalities of control. So in the writing I did on counterterrorism, there was a little bit less kind of vision of the possibility of resistance. I mean, given the particular context of those prisoners, the question was not can the prisoners like sort of come into subaltern speech, but can they exit the kind of circuit of communication that was being established by the torture practice? In some sense, it was very difficult to imagine what the interruption to that disruptive force was in that moment. But I think that I'm really taken by the types of infrastructural politics that, both Charmane and Louise gave in their discussions of like what it means to interrupt a technology's kind of extensive reach. We're also witnessing kind of sousvalent reuse of various forms of technological capture against police. And although those are on a much smaller scale than what the state is accomplishing, it's interesting to track where they'll go and how they'll transform the technologies themselves. So I'll leave it at that, but I think, yeah.
Was I next, Nisha? I forgot the order.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be quick. I think I said most of what I intended to, but I think I'll just say that sort of coming out of my work on logistics and thinking through the kind of planetary scale of just-in-time supply chains, I'll speak here as an organizer and not as an academic, but I've been working with Amazon warehouse workers in the space of the workplace to rethink what it might mean to think about warehouses and distribution spaces as spaces of resistance. And here I think the term that Joshua Clover has put to use, which is circulation struggle, has been really productive, which is that if we think about the dependency of accumulation strategies within global capitalism on these modes of logistical distribution, people who have been cast out of the industrialized workplace, out of the space of productivity, are now struggling in the marketplace, whose labor is sort of increasingly precaritized. And I find that to be a productive way to think about how the production of disruption from above is now sort of producing in turn disruption from below through an attempt to seize these strategic nodes of the choke points of capital. And so we're seeing increasingly, right, that resistance is taking place not necessarily in the space of the factory, but in the space of circulation, of pipeline flows, of port flows, of highway flows. And so, yeah, I suppose that I'm not sure. I would love to sort of debate back and forth with Louise about the question of whether it's interruption or disruption that we desire, because interruption to me feels periodic in a way that's not sufficient to the necessity of contestation in our age. And it seems to me that what we need is a disruption of another form, right? A disruption that can actually seek to unseat the power of the state and capital in sort of enforcing these structures over us. And finally, I think that struggling in the space of the university is crucial here, as Neel was pointing out. So thanks.
Thank you. I've just so enjoyed seeing you all and just talking together. It's been lovely. So, I mean, of course, I don't have an answer to this question of, what is the space for resistance? What is the kind of appropriate mode given, what Neel describes in his video as really this kind of rise of fascistic technologies, which, I think in so many of these cases is just undeniable. And he signals, a really important point in his video. He talks about the sort of the way that there's a parallel between newly enumerated rights and intensified inequalities, so that, so many of the debates currently about, for example, digital rights or AI ethics are, absolutely inadequate to the task in terms of what's actually happening here. So I think really I just signal the work of others in this space who I think are really doing a wonderful job of signaling how this might be done in a way that that resists inclusion and resists merely, a new set of newly enumerated rights, and resists that form. So Catherine McKittrick and her brilliant book Demonic Grounds, where she's rereading entirely the places that she sees negotiated by Black women after the slave trade. So she's reading the technologies of the slave ship, the slave auction block, and she is, if you like, reclaiming that space and reading that through a different lens. So and Brewer Benjamin's new book on race and technology, where she's formulating what she calls the new Jim code. So she's trying to think through, actually, how do we think through the continuities and discontinuities so that we avoid the kind of difficulties of saying, well, here are disruptions, and we perhaps then forget to signal here are the uninterrupted continuities of kind of deep inequality. So I think what she sets out there, which is about and she has examples in there, hyphen labs and other forms of the use of these kinds of technologies to precisely interrupt and to show how those modalities could be differently arranged. So I think that work is happening and it is being done. And it can't resolve the problem, because in so many ways it's not seeking a resolution. In so many ways it's actually not wanting that resolution at all. Is wanting to precisely open up the space for contestation and politics and not to resolve the problem. So thank you. I've just so enjoyed seeing everyone having this discussion. Now we have the challenge of writing the papers.
All right. Well, last but not least, Nicole, if you want to make a few closing remarks and before we wrap up.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think I would just echo what others have said, and really just to kind of similarly signal to people who are really kind of doing this work. I think this question about the difference between disruption from below, as Charmane articulates, and also Louise's ideas around interruption are interesting. And I definitely am looking forward to discussing that more. I think a number of, I think there are a number of folks who are talking about ways in which we can develop skill sets and technical capabilities to blind, to distract these kinds of technological interruptions in our lives. Obviously the rule of law is not sufficient to keep up with the pace of these kinds of innovations. And so, I'm really just trying to learn as much as I can from others about the kinds of creative habits and practices of, abolitionist movements and movements that are organizing around mutual aid to try to fill in kind of creative ways and generous ways where, the state has really kind of failed, right? Where the state has kind of evacuated these social spaces of transformation. I just want to thank everybody for coming and for listening and for your really awesome questions. Thank you.
All right, yeah, I would just like to thank everyone for being here. As Louise alluded to, these will be a set of papers that will be published in the journal, so look out for that. The talks will remain up, so if you've missed them or if you'd like to use them as a resource, they are available for after this talk. So thank you so much to everyone, and we hope that we'll see you soon, at least in the pages of the journal. So
thank you all so much. This is wonderful.
Thanks, Nisha. Thanks, everyone.